Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant to bring you part 7 of my Imperium vs. Terrans matchup. That's the Imperium of Man from Warhammer 40k against the Terrans from Starcraft. This section will be going over the tactics and strategies used by each side. Also, if you want to support the channel, there's a coffee link in the description. Like with my last section, I'll be covering a couple items I missed in the previous section. If you're up to date on the series, you know that the last section was the unique advantages that each side has, and it wasn't until after I posted the video that I realized I made a significant omission on the Imperium side. I forgot to mention the Primarchs. Originally, there were 20 of these guys who were created by the Emperor of Man to act as immortal generals and leaders in the Imperium. Not everything went according to plan, and in particular, the corruption of Horus led to the Horus Heresy, which ended in the Emperor of Man being reduced to a barely living corpse who's on a pretty extreme form of life support. I won't get into every Primarch or anything, especially since most are either dead, missing, or corrupted by chaos, but I mainly bring them up because they're the absolute pinnacle of what the Imperium can produce, second in power to the Emperor himself. The Lord Commander of the Imperium and the Imperial Regent is Rabute Guilliman, who is effectively the last of the Primarchs within the Imperium, and basically he's a super Space Marine, while also being the guy who's at least partially responsible for making the Space Marines into the crazy badasses that they are in the 41st millennium. He's also a super genius, particularly in the realm of strategy, and has led the Imperium to victory in multiple defenses and crusades. Granted, Primarchs aren't typically personally involved in a given conflict, but if they ever are, they get to combine a big dose of inherent badassness with a healthy dose of main character syndrome, and the fight is basically just won outright. The other thing I want to mention is the Sisters of Battle. They're weird. On the one hand, they're basically diet Space Marines in that they've got some pretty impressive armor and such, but they don't have the benefit of the gene seed, and they're not gigantic augmented forces of nature like the Space Marines are. What they do have is faith so intense that they get to basically wield it like magic in the form of miracles. Unlike Psykers, these miracles have nothing to do with the warp. In fact, as pointed out by commenter brother Azrael, there was even an incident in one of the more recent stories where the Necrons had used a device to cut an area off from the warp completely. No Psyker powers, no warp travel, no warp-based devices like void shields, nothing. And the Sisters of Battle could still use their miracles. What this means for the purposes of this comparison is that if the Terrans figure out a way of disrupting the warp in an area, a feat that I'm inclined to give them since they've managed to create several versions of psi disruptors, which can interfere with the Zerg hive mind, I'm going to assume that that won't work on the Sisters of Battle. They get to cheat in their own universe, so they get to cheat in the matchup as well. Alright, moving on to tactics. I'll start with the Terrans since they're simpler. Basically, the Terrans are all in on taking out their enemies before they can get close enough to hurt them. They know that they can't take on their enemies, the Zerg and the Protoss, in melee combat, so they do everything that they can to take those enemies out before they get that close. Be that through automatic weapons fire, artillery, missiles, whatever, everything is about keeping their distance. The only weapon that's even classified as melee range for the Terrans is the Hellbat Flamers, and those are still ranged. They're just much shorter range than rifles. In terms of overall strategies, it's really hard to say since get terrain advantage and kill the other guy before he kills you is strategy 101 and doesn't really set them apart. And I'm not going to get into like build sequences and stuff from the game because those don't really translate to real life very well. One thing I can absolutely point to though is how well they weaponize innovation. Rarely is the ultimate solution just shoot it till it dies for the Terrans, largely because they can't shoot it enough for it to die. Instead, they come up with technological solutions to the threats they face, be that the aforementioned psi disruptors, rescuing and unzergifying Kerrigan, or just inventing new weapons that are more effective at dealing with their enemies, like with the development of the Odin prototype, which later became the Thormak. On the Imperium side, the question of tactics is a bit complicated since it largely depends on who you're talking about within the Imperium. If you're talking the Imperial Guard, then the strategy is field a ton of soldiers, support them with tanks, and defeat your enemies via relatively conventional means. Shoot it till it dies. If it's Space Marines you're talking about, you've got to think about their tactics more like a Navy SEAL Special Forces kind of a thing. Sure, you might see Space Marines fighting in a pitched battle with, thousands of units around, but you're also fairly likely to see them being deployed to deal with more specific objectives, more like a scalpel than a hammer. They're commandos. This is due to the fact that there just aren't that many of them available, so deploying them en masse is just wasteful and unwise. It's often far more effective to use them to deal with priority targets than just to throw them into a giant battle. Even with all that said, there's still nuance, since not all Space Marines behave the same way. Get a group of Ultramarines on a battlefield with their bolters and they'll do plenty of damage. Get some Space Marines in Terminator armor wielding power claws though, and you'll see normal warfare turn into a real mess as they either jump jet or just teleport into the midst of enemy formations and begin just tearing them apart in melee. I'll also mention a bit regarding Titan tactics. As mentioned before, Titans are deployed in groups and are gigantic and durable, but that's not the whole picture. You see, void shields don't hug the thing that they're shielding and instead add more like a bubble surrounding the generator. This has the downside that enemies and sufficiently slow munitions can just walk straight through the void shields to attack Titans in this case, though of course this works for spacecraft as well, and you end up attacking them at point-blank range, but that comes with the added benefit that Titans can effectively shield their own forces as well, be that other Titans in their group or whole armies that are clustered at their feet. Effectively, Titans are mobile fortresses and offer a ton of battlefield utility even when they're not actually engaging in combat directly. And, being as powerful and valuable as they are, they're pretty much never sent into battle without a lot of support. It's like aircraft carriers. Sure, they're super powerful on their own with their aircraft and such, but you will never see an aircraft carrier on its own. They travel with a whole battle group, in part because it's more effective to do so this way, since all the ships can support each other, and also because carriers in particular are so valuable that leaving them on their own would just be foolish. In space, the only remarkable tactics used on either side are on the Imperium. That's because their tactics are insane. They make wide use of boarding tactics, which is logistically crazy but fairly effective in the universe, and most notably, they seem to love their ramming tactics. Granted, this is partially because of the way that void shields work, with them being totally ineffective against ship collisions, but it's a testament to not only their brutal tactics that they're willing to employ, but also the durability of their ships that they can actually survive ramming another ship. I'll also mention that Terran battlecruisers use relatively mundane tactics, shoot it till it dies, but as I've talked about repeatedly at this point, the primary weapon of the battlecruiser, the Yamato cannon, by nature of how it's designed, has to have a relatively limited maximum range. This is because it is essentially a plasma weapon that specifically requires magnetic containment to channel a ton of energy into a beam. That beam stops having magnetic containment as soon as it leaves the cannon, so it will immediately begin dissipating, just like how water sprayed from a hose may initially have a coherent beam-like quality to it, but as it travels, it will spread out more and more until that beam becomes a sprinkler. I reiterate this over and over again to make it clear that the Terran battlecruisers are most effective at short range, within 1,000 kilometers or so, which is pretty short in astronomical terms. Imperium ships use a lot of ballistic weapons, which have no maximum range, but have been documented to actually be able to hit targets at ranges of approximately the distance from the Earth to the Moon, which is a couple orders of magnitude beyond 1,000 kilometers. This is important because, yes, an object in motion tends to stay in motion. Ballistic weapons will just continue moving, but if the target is sufficiently far away, good luck hitting it. However, Imperium actually can hit targets at extreme ranges, which is incredible, and I'm not sure how that works, but it's documented and they can do it, so we have to go with it. That means that their effective range is pretty extreme. They also make use of beam weapons, which don't have unlimited range unlike projectiles, but are absolutely, definitely long range, certainly in excess of several thousand kilometers, though actual numbers on any of this stuff is largely unavailable, but we do what we can. I mean, there's games like Rogue Trader and Battlefleet Gothic. How canonical the numbers that they have is a little bit dicey, but in any case, they're absolutely fairly long range, certainly beyond several thousand kilometers. All right, finally, I want to mention super weapon use on each side. For the Terrans, using nukes is pretty common, though doing so requires a ghost operative to paint a target or a ship in orbit to just deploy less precisely targeted weaponry. They also have Apocalypse-class nukes, which are capable of basically performing exterminatus on a world, though doing so has massive political backlash, and after Korhal was nuked in this way, the weapons were banned. That doesn't mean that they never get used, but certainly not much. Likewise, exterminatus in all its forms, as used by the Imperium, is a last resort tactic largely reserved for some kind of unbeatable Xenos invasion like a Tyranid hive fleet, chaos corruption, or orc spores getting just too ingrained in a planet. Basically, this planet is totally unrecoverable, burn it. For the purposes of this matchup, I don't think either side will be using any kind of exterminatus scale weaponry, since for the Terrans that's just politically unacceptable to do so. And for the Imperium, clearing out a bunch of vanilla humans to take a planet is just a conventional problem that warrants conventional weapons and tactics, and just doesn't come to the level of needing scorched earth tactics. If the Terrans were some kind of virus that infects the bones of a planet and becomes incredibly well entrenched, sure, but so far at least, Terrans don't have that capability. All that said, the Terrans will still absolutely make use of tactical nukes, because that's just something they do all the time. And there you go. My all-too-brief summary of the tactics used by Terrans and Imperium. This is the last section where I cover elements of the matchup, so the next section will be the actual matchup, where I weigh all these factors against each other and give my conclusions. Let me know in the comments if there's anything significant that I didn't mention. Again, my knowledge on each side isn't even close to encyclopedic, so for any of you out there who know more than me, feel free to chip in, and if there's something I think is significant enough to make a difference, I will bring it up in the next section. Again, I have a Ko-fi link in the description if you wanted to support the channel, and until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.